Hot topic for content creators. This is where I pitch a topic to you guys, and then you guys turn around and create your own content on said topic. We're talking about, is traditional publishing obsolete? And tonight's subject on this topic is talking about what is traditional publishing. What does it mean to be traditionally published? So first, I want to start by just reading a little snippet here, a little excerpt from a quick Google search on traditional publishing. Traditional publishing is when you work with a mainstream publisher to handle the creative process and distribution of your book. Traditional publishing typically pays an advance and royalties. The pro to traditional publishing is that you will gain more connections and an enhanced distribution network. End quote. So it's pretty vague. It's still pretty vague, and I can see how people can kind of still misconstrue the idea of what it means to be traditionally published versus what it means to be an indie author. So I hope to clear that up a little bit here. And if you guys would like to chime in on this and drop your 2 cents, you're more than welcome. Okay, but this is to focus on what is it. But for this discussion in particular, bear in mind, we're focusing on what does it mean to be traditionally published, to be a traditionally published author. So with that quote right there, basically that's going to lead someone to ask, well, what's a mainstream publisher? And I think when you start going down that road, what's going to happen is you're going to start conflating the idea of mainstream with traditional. And I know that happens more often than not. And more often than not, people would be correct to assume that a mainstream or otherwise well-known publisher would be considered a traditional publisher. But that's not always the case. So what's a mainstream publisher? Does that just mean the big 5 if we're talking literature and the big 2 if we're talking comic books? Because if so, the big 5 being Simon & Schuster, Macmillan, HarperCollins, Penguin Random House, and Hachette Book Group. Okay, while the big 2 are recognized as DC and Marvel. So I will say that mainstream recognition alone is not the distinguishing factor that defines whether a publisher is considered traditional or independent. It is possible for an independently owned label to generate what would be considered mainstream success and still maintain the same operation it had when it was established. To understand the difference between traditional publishing and other forms of publishing, we have to take a closer look at the publisher's business model. So hopefully in doing so, I will be able to shed some light upon what it means to be a traditionally published author and what it means to be an indie author. So AKA independently published. Now, I don't go into too much detail on the ins and outs of what it means to be indie as much as I'm trying to focus on what it means to be traditionally published here. So before we begin, I would like to preface this discussion by acknowledging the fact that the publishing industry as a whole is not static, and the way in which any specific company conducts business may be subject to change based on a variety of factors, from economic conditions to social phenomena. And the following information is intended to be personal opinions that serve as a form of suggestive reference rather than rigid definitions. In no way am I labeling or referring to any publishing company in particular, and any similarities between a specific company's business model and the examples I'm providing are strictly by coincidence and should not be interpreted as my characterization or mischaracterization of any specific corporate entity. So here are what I believe to be three key components, which indicates that the publishing house in question follows the traditional business model. So number one, and what should be considered a dead giveaway, but I'll mention it anyway because I don't like to make a habit of underestimating the naivete of general audiences today, let's just say. The business has a corporate structure with hands-off ownership led by a CEO, influenced by shareholders, and or employs middle management positions. That is quite literally the traditional corporate structure in a nutshell. However, there are other more subtle indicators that constitute the traditional way of running a publishing company. Number two, the publisher does not accept unsolicited submissions from unrepresented individuals. I've heard that some publishing houses won't even look at unsolicited manuscripts received through the mail. For all intents and purposes, they get tossed directly into the trash. They do not pass go, and they do not even warrant a response, let alone $200 in advance. This form of gatekeeping is usually under the guise of legal risk in order to maintain benefit of doubt and save face. But I think this level of gatekeeping really just boils down to cost-benefit analysis. Think about whether or not it's really worth it to be paying your employees overtime wages to sort through a slush pile of random shit from an insurmountable quantity of no-name writers, and on top of that, a wild variety of quality. Nevertheless, the use of middlemen in this instance, i.e. agents, okay, is a part of the traditional business model. It's not that the publishing house won't accept an unsolicited manuscript. It's just that the manuscript needs to be submitted through the proper channels, aka a trusted source, aka an agent that the company probably knows on a first name basis. So in other words, there's people that you have to suck up to and you have to reach out to. It's like a whole step-by-step process to getting traditionally published. There's all these obstacles in the way. Number three, the author must compromise some amount of creative control. Now, I know this is going to be a contentious one, all right? And my opinion here on this one might surprise some of you, actually. So number three indicator that you're dealing with a traditional publisher is that the author must compromise some amount of creative control. So usually a traditional publishing house will have their own team of editors. And when an author signs a deal, they will be assigned a developmental editor to work with. In traditional publishing deals, once the contract is signed, the book is no longer recognized as a solitary creative project as much as it is now considered a business venture in which the author has entered into a partnership with the publishing house. So the author is not the star of the show, so to speak. So if you're being considered for a traditional publishing deal, then your attitude is expected to be that of a team player and not a prima donna. Okay, so I think that there's like this thing sometimes. Now, this is where I'm going to toss in my 2 cents. There's this thing sometimes where I think that sometimes like people who are querying, so like aspiring authors who have yet to be published, and they're querying agents, and they're trying to get traditionally published. There's like this kind of like air of delusion a little bit that I think surrounds the publishing industry, where it's like, some of these wannabe kind of trad pub authors think that that's how they're going to be treated and that's how their project is going to be looked at, but they're failing to look at it from a business perspective. You got to think about the amount of hubris that is there, or the amount, perhaps even the amount of entitlement that is involved when, say, you do find an agent and you do get an offer or a full request from one of the big five publishing houses, and they make you an offer where they're going to be paying you in advance of, if you're a first time author, maybe it's somewhere between $20,000, $30,000 up front, or maybe dispersed out in checks over the course of a year, what have you, whatever's in the contract. Okay. So you're going to get that much money, 5 figures, usually at least 5 figures up front, written out in a check for you. All right. For your manuscript, and you got to sign a contract. And then you, as the author, think that you're just going to retain full creative control, and you're going to be the one that's effectively going to have, effectively barking orders at the publishing house and how they handle your manuscript. Well, I got news for you. When you sign that contract, this is why I say you got to be very aware of what it is that you're negotiating. Don't be afraid to negotiate. By all means, please negotiate. I definitely push people to know what it is that you're signing before you sign the dotted line, and negotiate for whatever it is that you want. However, in that same vein, I actually do understand where the publishing houses are coming from when they're putting their money up front. What they're doing is they are effectively making a good faith investment in you, not only as an artiste, all right, but as a business partner, a partner in this venture. So they're seeing your book, they see potential in it. They see potential in your manuscript as a business investment, and they're investing in you and your not only your book, but your ability, not only as an author, but your potential as a business partner. So that's what these deals are about. There's multiple angles in which you look at these deals. It's not just them fawning over your greatness, okay? And they're just completely blown away by your manuscript, and it's the greatest thing since Shakespeare, all right? Now, that may be the case, and they may be like, wow, this is some good stuff, that it stands out amongst the rest of the stuff that they're getting in the slush pile, through the proper channels, as it were. But when they're signing you on, if you have, almost guarantee, if you go into the negotiation table and you have this prima donna kind of attitude about you, that you're an artiste and stuff like that, and you come across as like you're going to be difficult to work with, they probably won't think twice about sending you packing, and just be like, yeah, it sounded like it was good on pen and paper, but yeah, we're not interested. We figure we'd try to toss you a bone, you ain't biting, that's fine. That's your decision. But I think we're going to pass on this time around. You know what I mean? So that's where they're at. Now, on the flip side of that, if you've actually put in the work and you've established a name for yourself, you have a following, and you bring value to the table other than your work of art, aka your manuscript, and you have kind of that what they call a blue chip at the negotiation table, which is in the form of your own audience that you can market to, there might be room for a lot more demands as far as that goes, and you wouldn't come across as being unreasonable or difficult as far as that goes. So what am I talking about here? So now that we understand that when you sign with a traditional publisher, it's a partnership deal that you're entering into. It's not they are just working for you and they are your lemmings, they are your slaves that you command, and they work at, at your to satisfy every whim as far as your work goes, because it's no longer your work. That's you need to get across here. Once you sign with a traditional publishing house, what would be a traditional publishing deal, it's no longer your work. It's what they would consider our work. Okay. So that's what I mean by that. So now what happens is, everything from the revisions to that manuscript to the cover art, it becomes a matter of what is in the best interest of all parties involved. Okay, not just your opinion as the artist of what you would like it to be. So from the revisions to the cover art, it becomes a matter of what is in the best interest of all parties involved. But the degree to which varies depending upon what was negotiated in the contract. So in other words, the publishing house could actually have final say as to what happens with the project, which includes the marketing and the advertising. So that's why I say you don't want to be afraid to negotiate, but you also got to understand, because everybody's situation is different, what you're getting involved in the publishing industry for. What are your intentions? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? If you're just trying to get, if that's just a goal of yours, I just want to get published by a mainstream traditional publishing house. That's it. That's my goal. If that's your goal as a writer, then you may be willing to give up more creative control than, say, somebody who's more passionate about their work and they're in it for the artistic merits of the work. So they may see, even that type of individual may see getting published by a traditional publisher, it proves something to them, and they may see that as a form of prestige or an accolade of some sort, to add to their list of accomplishments, but they might not be willing to give up so much creative control. So there's that aspect of it. What you're actually negotiating there is you're going to the table and look at it from the perspective of, okay, this is a partnership deal, because in the essence of it, of what you're negotiating, that is what it is. It's almost as if they helped you write the book, because at that point now they are, because they're using their resources, including their developmental editor that they assign to you to work with. So, and I think that also it varies on an individual case-by-case basis, but from the gist, from what I've heard through the grapevine in AuthorTube, because I myself am not a traditionally published author, that is, to my understanding, how things work. But having a business background, that just makes sense to me. That all around, that makes sense. That is how it's viewed. That is how things work. So I hope that helps to clear things up for some folks. But I think the most important thing to take away from this discussion is that when I say traditional publishing, what I'm referring to is the business model itself. Now, of course, the prompt for this hot topic suggests that there are other forms of publishing, and perhaps we could discuss pros and cons of those other business models, as it were, that are out there in the publishing industry, if you'd be interested in the subject. We could also talk about what it means to be an independently published author. Spoiler alert, it doesn't mean one person needs to do everything on their own in order to be called an indie author.